The moment I realized I was only valued for what I paid did not arrive with shouting, dramatic accusations. It came quietly, wrapped in casual words and familiar expectations, the kind that slip past your defenses because they sound like love. I had spent years believing that my place in the family was earned through reliability, that being the one who solved problems and covered gaps made me important. I told myself that contribution was connection, that sacrifice was loyalty. But one evening, as I sat staring at yet another message asking me to handle it, something finally clicked. No one asked how I was doing. No one wondered what it cost me. The only thing that mattered was whether I could pay, fix, or rescue them again. I thought back to all the times my phone rang only when something went wrong. A bill overdue, an emergency repair, a sudden expense no one had planned for. The conversations always started warmly, with concern or praise, but they ended the same way, with an expectation that I would step in. And I always did. I rearranged my budget, postponed my own plans, worked longer hours, and told myself that family comes first. What I didn't notice at the time was how invisible I had become as a person. My opinions didn't matter unless they came with financial support. My presence was optional, but my money was not. The realization deepened when I noticed how different the energy was when I said no. Even gently, the warmth disappeared. The affection cooled. Suddenly, I was difficult, selfish, or overreacting. The same people who praised my generosity moments earlier now questioned my loyalty. It became painfully clear that love, in their eyes, was conditional. As long as I provided comfort and stability, I was welcomed. The moment I hesitated, my value dropped. I wasn't a daughter or a sibling in those moments. I was a resource. What hurt the most was not the money itself, but the absence of gratitude. There was no acknowledgement of the strain, no curiosity about my limits. My sacrifices were treated as expected duties, not choices. Over time, I stopped being thanked and started being reminded that I was the responsible one, reminded that I could handle it, reminded that things would fall apart without me. Those reminders were not compliments. They were chains disguised as praise. I remember sitting alone one night, reviewing my finances, realizing how much of my life had been quietly redirected to support others. Comfort, dreams I had delayed, rest I had denied myself, all in the name of keeping peace. And in that stillness, I understood something that changed everything. If my worth vanished the moment I stopped paying, then I had never truly been valued at all. I had been useful, not loved, convenient, not respected. That truth was devastating, but it was also clarifying. It stripped away years of confusion and self-doubt. I stopped asking why I felt empty despite giving so much. I stopped blaming myself for feeling resentful. The problem was not my generosity. It was the imbalance that turned generosity into obligation. I had been taught that endurance was proof of love, but endurance without respect only leads to quiet self-erasure. Realizing I was only valued for what I paid was painful, but it gave me something priceless. Awareness. Awareness that love should not require self-neglect. Awareness that my presence mattered even without a contribution attached. Awareness that I deserved relationships where care flowed both ways. That moment did not make me bitter. It made me honest. And honesty, for the first time, felt like freedom. Growing up invisible in a family, obsessed with image, meant learning early that being seen had nothing to do with being present. In our house, attention followed sparkle, charm, and whatever made the family look impressive to the outside world. Quiet achievements, steady effort, and emotional needs did not register unless they could be displayed or admired. I learned to take up less space, to speak softly, and to avoid becoming inconvenient. While others were praised for how they appeared, I was measured by how little trouble I caused. From a young age, I understood that approval was selective. It wasn't given for honesty or kindness, but for performance. Compliments were reserved for moments that could be shown off to neighbors, relatives, or strangers. A good outfit earned more praise than a good grade. A confident smile mattered more than hard work. I watched how conversations shifted when guests were around, how voices became warmer, how laughter grew louder. Behind closed doors, the same warmth disappeared, replaced by expectations and quiet comparisons. I learned that love was something displayed, not deeply felt. Being invisible did not mean being unimportant. It meant being unnoticed until needed. I was the one people relied on when something broke or went wrong, but rarely the one they celebrated. My role was functional, not emotional. I existed to support the picture, not to be part of it. Over time, I stopped expecting recognition. I became skilled at solving problems silently, at fixing things without asking for credit. I told myself that usefulness was enough. That belonging came from being dependable. What I didn't realize was how deeply that belief was shaping my sense of self. In a family obsessed with image, mistakes were dangerous because they threatened appearances. Emotions that didn't fit the narrative were ignored or dismissed. Sadness was inconvenient. Anger was embarrassing. Questions were seen as disrespect. So I learned to hide what I felt. I smiled when I was hurt. I nodded when I disagreed. I swallowed disappointment because it was easier than explaining it to people who didn't want to hear it. Silence became my shield, and invisibility felt safer than honesty. As I grew older, the pattern followed me. I became the reliable one, the calm one, the one who didn't ask for much. People praised my independence without noticing how it was born from neglect rather than strength. I was told I was mature for my age, but maturity was just another word for adapting to being overlooked. I learned to meet my own needs because asking felt pointless. When I succeeded, it was expected. When I struggled, it was unnoticed. The hardest part of growing up invisible was not the lack of attention, but the slow erosion of self-worth. When no one mirrors your value back to you, you start to question whether it exists at all. I doubted my importance, minimized my achievements, and dismissed my own needs as excessive. I believed that wanting more attention or care made me selfish. I thought love had to be earned through effort and silence, not freely given. Yet invisibility also taught me something unexpected. In the absence of praise, I learned self-reliance. Without applause, I discovered my own standards. I built an inner world where my worth did not depend on being admired. While others focused on how things looked, I learned how things worked. I found meaning in substance rather than surface. That quiet strength carried me forward, even when no one noticed. Growing up invisible in a family, obsessed with image left scars. But it also revealed the truth. Being unseen does not mean being insignificant. It means the wrong people were looking. And one day, I stopped trying to be visible to those who only valued appearances and began learning how to see myself. When helping turned into an unspoken obligation, it didn't happen all at once. There was no clear moment when kindness crossed a line and became expectation. It began with small requests, framed as temporary favors, each one reasonable on its own. A bill that needed covering until payday. A problem that only I could solve because I was good at these things. Every time I said yes, it felt like the right thing to do. Helping gave me purpose, and being needed felt close enough to being loved. At first, gratitude flowed easily. Thank yous were frequent, promises of repayment sincere, and I believed that support moved both ways. I told myself that this was what family did for each other. But over time, the language changed. Requests stopped sounding like favors and started sounding like assumptions. There was no longer hesitation in asking, no checking if I could afford it or if I was overwhelmed. The help I offered freely became something quietly expected, as if my role had been decided without my consent. The shift was subtle but relentless. I noticed it in the way conversations were framed. Problems were presented to me already half solved, with my contribution implied. Decisions were made first, and I was informed later, usually with a casual reminder that I would understand or figure it out. I wasn't asked if I wanted to help anymore. I was told what needed to be handled. My generosity had rewritten the rules, and I hadn't even realized it. What made it harder to see was the praise that came with the pressure. I was called reliable, strong, The backbone. These words sounded like compliments, but they carried weight. They were used to justify why I should give more, why I should stretch myself thinner. If I ever hesitated, the tone shifted immediately. Concern turned into disappointment. Questions were met with guilt. I was reminded of everything I had already done, as if past kindness meant future compliance was mandatory. Slowly, I began to feel trapped by my own reputation. Saying no felt like betrayal. Rest felt like laziness. I started measuring my worth by how much I could carry for others. The more I helped, the more invisible my needs became. There was no space for my exhaustion or frustration. Those emotions didn't fit the image of the dependable one, so I buried them and kept going, convincing myself that this was just what responsibility looked like. The obligation became clearest in the moments when I couldn't help. The disappointment was immediate and sharp, as if I had broken an unspoken contract. The warmth faded, replaced by tension and silence. It was then I understood that my value had become transactional. My presence was appreciated only as long as it came with solutions. The help I once gave out of love had been absorbed into entitlement. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being useful rather than cared for. I felt it deeply during those years. I was surrounded by people, yet emotionally alone. No one asked how the constant giving was affecting me. No one noticed the strain because things kept working. That was the problem. As long as I held everything together, no one questioned the cost. When helping turns into an unspoken obligation, it steals more than time or money. It erodes choice. It blurs the line between love and duty until you forget that support should be mutual. Realizing this was painful, but necessary. It taught me that generosity without boundaries invites exploitation, even from those closest to you. Helping should come from willingness, not pressure, and love should never require self-sacrifice so complete that you disappear in the process. The wedding that exposed years of emotional exploitation was supposed to be a celebration, a moment when family gathered to honor love and new beginnings. Instead, it became a mirror that reflected everything that had been quietly wrong for years. What unfolded in those final weeks was not sudden or surprising, but the result of long-standing patterns finally pushed into the open. The pressure, the assumptions, and the emotional manipulation that had once been subtle were suddenly impossible to ignore. From the beginning, the wedding was framed as a shared family effort, something everyone would contribute to in their own way. In reality, the contributions were never equal. Emotional labor, financial responsibility, and problem-solving flowed in one direction. Decisions were made without my input, but the consequences were left for me to manage. Each request came wrapped in language about pride, image, and family honor, making it difficult to refuse without being labeled unsupportive or selfish. What should have been a choice was treated as an obligation. The closer the wedding came, the heavier the emotional weight became. Excitement turned into expectation. Gratitude turned into entitlement. The language shifted from, "Can you help?" to, "This needs to be handled." There was no acknowledgement of the stress or the cost, only reminders of how important it was to keep everything perfect. Perfection was never about happiness. It was about appearance. The wedding was not meant to celebrate love, but to protect an image that had been carefully constructed for years. What made the exploitation so difficult to confront was how normalized it had become. I had been trained to equate my worth with what I provided. So when the demands increased, I blamed myself for feeling overwhelmed. I told myself this was temporary, that once the wedding was over, things would settle down. But deep down, I knew the truth. There would always be another event, another crisis, another reason why I was needed more than I was cared for. The breaking point came not from the money itself, but from the way I was spoken to, the casual dismissal of my feelings, the implication that my role was to support without question, and the subtle reminders of where I stood in the family hierarchy stripped away any remaining doubt. The wedding did what years of quiet discomfort could not. It exposed the imbalance clearly and painfully. I was not a participant. I was a resource. When I finally stepped back, the reaction confirmed everything. Panic replaced appreciation. Accusations replaced understanding. The urgency was not about repairing relationships, but about salvaging appearances. That response revealed the truth more clearly than any argument ever could. If love had been the foundation, concern for my well-being would have come first. Instead, the only fear was embarrassment and loss of control. Watching the wedding unravel was not satisfying. There was no joy in seeing plans collapse or people scramble. What I felt was a strange calm, the kind that comes when denial finally ends. The chaos was not created by my refusal to continue. It was the result of years of dependence built on emotional pressure and silence. The structure had been unstable long before I stepped away. It only took one boundary for it to fall. That wedding did more than expose emotional exploitation. It ended it. It forced a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. In the aftermath, I saw my role with clarity for the first time. I had been carrying expectations that were never meant to be mine. Walking away was not an act of cruelty or revenge. It was an act of self-respect. The celebration that was meant to showcase perfection instead revealed truth. And that truth changed everything. Choosing boundaries over guilt and walking away was not a dramatic decision made in anger. It was slow, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable, shaped by years of conditioning that taught me my worth was tied to how much I could endure for others. Guilt had always been my leash. It whispered that saying no was selfish, that protecting myself meant abandoning people who depended on me. For a long time, I listened to that voice because it sounded like love. But eventually, the cost of obedience became greater than the fear of disappointing anyone else. Setting boundaries felt unnatural at first. My body reacted before my mind caught up. My chest tightened, my thoughts raced, and every old label surfaced at once. Ungrateful, difficult, cold. These were the words I had been trained to fear. Walking away meant risking those judgments, accepting that I might never be understood by the very people whose approval I had chased my entire life. The guilt was intense, not because I was doing something wrong, but because I was doing something new. What made it harder was the absence of immediate relief. Walking away did not bring instant peace. It brought silence, doubt, and a deep sense of loss. Even when relationships are harmful, they are still familiar, and familiarity can feel safer than freedom. I grieved not only the family I stepped back from, but the hope that things might one day change if I just tried harder. Letting go of that hope was painful, but necessary. Hope had kept me stuck longer than anything else. Guilt thrives on the belief that you owe people endless access to you simply because of shared history. Choosing boundaries challenged that belief. I began to understand that love does not require self-abandonment. Respect cannot exist where boundaries are constantly violated. The more I honored my limits, the clearer it became how often they had been ignored before. The resistance I faced when I stopped overgiving was proof that my boundaries were needed all along. Walking away was not about punishing anyone. It was about removing myself from a role that was slowly erasing me. I had spent years explaining, justifying, and shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. In choosing boundaries, I finally allowed myself to be uncomfortable instead. That shift changed everything. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped negotiating my worth. I accepted that some people would only understand my value once I was no longer available to exploit. There is a particular loneliness that comes with choosing yourself after a lifetime of being chosen last. The quiet can be unsettling. Without constant demands, I had to confront parts of myself I had long ignored. My exhaustion, my resentment, my unmet needs. Walking away forced me to sit with those feelings instead of numbing them through service. It was not easy, but it was honest. Over time, guilt began to loosen its grip. Each boundary I held, even when it was met with anger or silence, strengthened my sense of self. I learned that guilt is not always a sign of wrongdoing. Sometimes it is simply the echo of old conditioning resisting change. As I stopped responding to manipulation disguised as concern, clarity replaced confusion. I no longer questioned why I felt drained around certain people. I trusted my experience. Choosing boundaries over guilt did not make me cruel. It made me free. Walking away was not the end of love. It was the beginning of self-respect. I learned that distance can be an act of compassion, both for myself and for others, without resentment clouding every interaction. I could finally breathe. I did not walk away to be dramatic or to prove a point. I walked away to survive with my dignity intact. Finding freedom, peace, and self-worth beyond family approval did not feel like a victory at first. It felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, like stepping into a quiet room after years of constant noise. For so long, my sense of value had been shaped by how useful I was, how much I gave, and how little trouble I caused. Without those measures, I didn't immediately know who I was. Letting go of the need for approval meant facing an emptiness that approval had once filled, even if it had always been conditional. In the early days, freedom felt lonely. There were no urgent calls, no expectations waiting to be met, no unspoken rules to navigate. I had more time, more money, and more mental space, yet I felt strangely unanchored. I realized how much of my identity had been built around earning love through endurance. Peace did not arrive as relief, but as stillness, and stillness forced me to listen to myself for the first time. It revealed how tired I truly was. As the noise faded, clarity began to take its place. I noticed how my body responded differently to life without constant pressure. I slept better. My thoughts slowed. Decisions no longer carried the weight of imagined judgment. I could choose what I wanted without rehearsing explanations in my head. That quiet autonomy became a form of peace I had never known, one that did not depend on anyone else's mood or approval. Self-worth began to grow not from praise, but from alignment. I started to respect myself because my actions matched my values. I honored my limits. I invested my energy where it was returned. For the first time, I measured my life by how it felt rather than how it looked to others. The absence of family approval, once terrifying, slowly lost its power. I realized that approval had never protected me. It had only kept me small. There were moments of doubt. Old voices surfaced, questioning my choices, reminding me of the roles I had abandoned. But those voices grew quieter as my confidence strengthened. I learned that not being chosen by people who only valued what I provided was not rejection. It was release. I no longer had to audition for belonging. I built it instead, through friendships grounded in mutual respect and work that reflected my abilities rather than my availability. Peace, I discovered, is not the absence of conflict, but the absence of self-betrayal. It came from knowing I would not abandon myself to keep others comfortable. It came from trusting that my worth was inherent, not earned through sacrifice. Freedom followed naturally, not as rebellion, but as self-acceptance. I stopped explaining my choices to people who were committed to misunderstanding them. Finding self-worth beyond family approval reshaped how I understood love. Love without respect is control. Love that requires silence is not love at all. As I internalized this truth, my relationships changed. I became more selective, more present, and more honest. I no longer chased validation. I allowed connection to form where it was safe, balanced, and genuine. Looking back, I see that freedom was never about cutting ties or proving strength. It was about returning to myself after years of living for others. Peace came when I stopped asking for permission to exist as I was. Self-worth emerged when I realized that I did not need to be chosen to matter. I was enough long before anyone approved of me. And in that realization, I found a life that finally felt like my own.